And now we are at the point where if someone proposed we do something even a tenth of what Iraq was, there would be instant public outcry and nobody would support it. So that is one way in which things have changed a bit. But even that isn't really getting at the nub, I suppose, of what I'm trying to get at here. I mean, I want to talk about what I think America really is and what I think... Whoa. Okay, it's okay. What I think America really is and what I think America's real value to the world is. And I want to try to do this without falling into cliches and, things that sound like propaganda reels, because it's a little too easy to fall into doing that, and this is kind of difficult because it requires me using my brain muscle a little bit, and I don't really get to use my brain muscle too much these days, unfortunately. So we're gonna see how it goes, but the notion that we are sort of taught to believe in America is that America is this, this sort of bastion of freedom and democracy in the world and all that, which sounds a lot like a propaganda thing. And when I became old enough to think critically about it, that's precisely what I did think. That all this about America being the, this great beacon of light and prosperity in the world was pretty much just propaganda. And when I thought about it, it's like, how could it be so? Because of all the things that were wrong in America. But the thing is, you really have to look at the development of world history in the last century or two, and when you do so, you really do get a deeper appreciation of what America has really done for the world by its actions and its examples. I mean, you have to remember, just a very short time ago, not even 100 years in most parts of even the Western world, not even the Third World, but in the Western world, we were pretty much still ruled by kings, Germany had their Kaiser, and Austria had their Habsburgs, and so on like that. And, sure, these countries had parliaments and such, but the idea of nationalism was still largely, in many cases, based around, royals and dynasties and such. And also, I've talked about the whole spectrum between individuality and conformity. Most of Europe was, at that time, way too far towards conformity. They didn't really value the individual that much. Now, you've probably heard me argue that in modern-day America, it's gone way too much towards individualism and more conformity is needed, and by that, you probably got this impression that I'm like some sort of ultra-conformist that thinks that everyone should, fall in line and look and act one way. But really, that's not true. I believe in the balance between conformity and individuality, and I think just as much as America is too much towards individualism, in those days, Europe was far too much towards conformity. The individual life didn't matter, and people were willing to throw themselves away for kings, for various ideas, various ideologies, without really thinking too much of it, without thinking that maybe their life is too valuable to waste on some fool's idea, The most triumphant example, the one that is most well known, of course, is Nazi Germany. And think of how many people, even if you take out for a moment the Jews and everyone else who was killed in the Holocaust, think about how many Germans died to bring forward Hitler's philosophies, and how many just willingly said, yep, this is a good idea, and just sort of went along with it, even if it meant their own deaths. It's a big number. It's not something small, and but that was only sort of the more extreme example of what things were at the time. I mean, the rights of the individual were not really a big deal. I mean, sure, there were philosophers who would say otherwise at the time, but, they were sort of ahead of their time. They weren't really saying what the mainstream populace at the time was saying. So, basically, things really aren't growing over here. Oh, well, we need more industry. But yeah, whereas in America, we were a country built on individual liberty, and we had a much more balanced approach back then than we do now. Like, we still believed in collective things. I'm speaking, late 19th, early 20th century. We still had a good enough balance between a collective and individual way of thinking that we pretty much had it down pat at the time. And we were willing to fight and die for things greater than one person. But we also always did care about the individual, because we sort of realized that, nations were made up of people. And if you look after the people, you look after the nation. I mean, there was a reason that so many people wanted to come to America, and immigrate, because they saw opportunity. The whole land of opportunity thing is not a propaganda thing. It really was what people were thinking. So, yes, I know, but this is a low-density city, so you can go eat a cow. Yeah, what if I do this? No, that's stupid. Okay. But when you think about the modern Europe today, and how everything seems so liberal and so modern and progressive, and you wonder, but the Europe I read about in my history books was a place strife with war, and the class system was very regimented, and there were nobles and peasants and all that shit, and suddenly it's this freaking socialist utopia, in quotes. It's this freaking place where, quite frankly, people enjoy more freedoms than they do here in many cases. And I'll admit that. It's true. I'm not proud of it, but it's a fact in many cases. Not all, but many. And you say, how did Europe get that way? Well, as we all should at least know, in the first half of the 20th century, there were two very devastating wars that completely transformed the way that that Europe looked and functioned. You might have heard of these. We tend to call them World War I and World War II. we're not just, long-standing states were shattered, like the Ottoman Empire and the Habsburg monarchy were shattered. But it was more than just that. It was just like the entire way of life in Europe was shattered, and more so in World War II. I mean, a good amount of the entire continent was pretty much bombed into the ground, whether by Germans or by Allied forces. It pretty much, it pretty much was reduced to rubble, so much of it. And, a lot of what people valued at the time is what led them to things like supporting Hitler and eventually led to these deaths. So I think people realized, whether they could put it into words or not at the time, they realized not only that they need to rebuild physically, but they just sort of needed to essentially rebuild their entire society, rebuild how they thought about the world. And think about who was the biggest economic, the biggest undamaged economic power. Which country had not been bombed by virtue of the fact that it was on the other side of the freaking world from everything else? Well, it was us, of course. And to a much lesser extent, Canada. They were helpful, but you have to remember they're a tenth of the size of us, therefore a tenth of the influence, if all other things are equal. But we had the Marshall Plan. We helped rebuild Europe, and I'm talking about Western Europe. Of course, the Soviet Union rebuilt Eastern Europe, and I think the differences between Eastern and Western Europe are self-evident, and I really don't need to go into why the American system was better than the Soviet one. I think that's a given. I think everyone knows that, so I don't have to go into that. But the Western Europe was pretty much rebuilt around the American system. Sure, it was the American system with European elements, but you have to remember the American system was sort of just, sort of European Enlightenment ideas that could not really be practiced in Europe because of its just sort of conservatism. At one point, America was the great liberal playground, and, Europe was the conservative shithole. That's only really reversed in the, I want to say last 30 to 40 years, in the, the post, the rising of the Christian right and the Ronald Reagan people. That's what really killed that in America. But, we were the testing grounds for many of these Enlightenment-era ideas that might have started in Europe, but they didn't really take root there because, like I said, things were way too conservative in Europe at the time. So these ideas came to root here, and they're like, wow, these people who, compare America in, let's say, 1815 to 1915. In 1815, we basically were all, there were 3, 4, 5 million of us crammed up against the East Coast, and the best we could do in the War of 1812 was pretty much be a distraction to the British. Not really anything major was changed by our involvement in that war that I know of anyway. That's not really taught too well in schools, to be honest. But but you fast forward just 100 years, which in the history of mankind, 100 years really isn't that long. Dynasties have risen and fallen in less time than that. individual wars, like the 100 Years' War, which lasted 116 years, happened in time spans that were longer. In just that time, we had become a continental empire. We had expanded our territory all the way from one side of our continent to another. We had won a minor war against an established imperial power, which was Spain, and made it look like child's play. We just raffle-stomped them. And we were expanding into the Pacific. We controlled the Philippines. We just had all these things going for us. And we were either passing or about to pass our parents, the British, in population. Because so many people had moved in because we let them. We wanted them here. And they enriched us. And one of the key things to remember is the immigrants of those times, actually did assimilate, The Irish, the Italians, when they started out in America, they could have not been more different than, the standard American way of doing things. But over time, the Irish and the Italians and other groups, they became like us. But they didn't lose themselves when they became like us. They kept with them their certain aspects of their culture and their heritage that really enriched our way of life too, culturally, and in food, which I love food, so of course I'm going to use food as an example. But it's and these people swelled our ranks, They didn't leech off us. They didn't take advantage of us. They joined us, and they made us stronger. And by that time, this land, which had, to Europeans, it must have seemed like yesterday, we were this colonial backwater. And now we are this world power. And so things were going quite well. And then when the World Wars happened in Europe, especially World War II, we came in, and with our vast military might and economic might, our vast capacity to produce and to produce safely outside the bombing range, we were able to basically just overpower the Germans. You have to understand how powerful the Germans were. The Nazis were innovating in ways that had never been done before. Like, there was so much technological advancement in Nazi Germany, and not just technological, but new management styles were being worked on. There were new ways of setting up the bureaucracy to handle these things were being worked on. A lot of it was undermined by a lot of corruption. There was a lot of corruption in the Nazi regime, but even with that, it was working out so well, and we were able to stop them. We were able to shut that down. And because, you never know. If they had won, maybe their model of how to do things in the world would have become standard. And do any of us want to live in that kind of world? I don't think many of us do. I don't. But, like I was saying before, Europe had pretty much been bombed into the ground. Allied and Axis cities alike. And we had to rebuild Europe. The British had never been occupied. They were doing okay too, but they had been bombed. They, were sort of bogged down with colonial problems in India and stuff. They had a rough time of it. So it was really mainly America at the forefront of the rebuilding. And I think a higher portion of that money ended up going to Britain than any other country anyway. The Marshall Plan money, that is.